Hello, everybody. Welcome again to Storytime from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today comes from Germany, and it's about a king who didn't get everything that he wanted when he got married, but he figured out how to make things better anyway. This is the story of the queen who couldn't bake gingerbread. King Pilaf of Mulligatawny was having a bad day. When he woke up and he got out of bed that morning, he bumped his head against the Lord Chamberlain's head, and it hurt. And then when he started to get dressed, he found a hole in the heel of his stocking that was as big as a marble. He was not at all happy. He said, "Lord Chamberlain, I have been thinking that it is about time that I had a wife and the kingdom had a queen, and then perhaps she could help me find a tailor who can mend my socks." Well, the Lord Chamberlain looked at the king and he said, "My Lord King, I think that is a very good idea. In fact, I have been thinking about the same thing. This is what I have been thinking about it." But the king stopped him. "Lord High Chamberlain, it is far too early in the morning for one of your speeches. Let's go to breakfast." The king sighed as he walked down to breakfast, for he knew that the gingerbread with breakfast was going to be crumbly. He did not like crumbly gingerbread. He wanted his gingerbread to be not too hard and not too soft, just properly crisp. But it was always crumbly. Sure enough, he and the Lord Chamberlain sat down to their breakfast, and they had their cheese omelets, and they had their juice and their coffee, and then they had their gingerbread, and it was crumbly. The king looked at the crumbs on the plate, and he said, "Lord High Chamberlain, I want a wife who is beautiful, and I need a wife who is wise and going to help me rule my kingdom. But I think that also my wife should be able to bake gingerbread." Well, now it was the Lord High Chamberlain's turn to sigh, for you see, when King Pilaf had become king, he had turned the kingdom upside down looking for a baker who could bake gingerbread the way he wanted it. And the baker they had in the palace was the best one they had been able to find in the entire kingdom. Well, King Pilaf and the Lord High Chamberlain got ready, and they rode off on their horses to the first kingdom, the kingdom of Gore. And when they arrived at the kingdom of Gore, they were taken to see the Princess Madelon. The Princess Madelon was as beautiful as she was wise. But when the king asked her if she could make gingerbread, she said that she could not, but that she could bake perfect little almond cakes. The king thought about that for a little while. Princess Madelon was very beautiful, and she was very wise, but while maybe he could learn to like almond cakes, what he really liked was gingerbread. And so they thanked the Princess Madelon, and they traveled on. Next, the king and the Lord High Chamberlain came to the kingdom of Shogun. And in the kingdom of Shogun, they were introduced to the Princess Jebel. Now, the Princess Jebel was very beautiful. She was not quite as wise as she was beautiful. And when the king asked her if she could bake gingerbread, she said that she could not, but she could bake the perfect Zwieback. Well, no, Zwieback was not gingerbread. And so the king thanked the Princess Jebel and traveled on. The next kingdom they came to was the kingdom of Tintinnabulum. And in the kingdom of Tintinnabulum was the Princess Calliope. The Princess Calliope was not as beautiful as she was wise. And when King Pilaf and the Lord High Chamberlain entered the room, she said, "Ah, King Pilaf, I think perhaps you have come searching for a wife. You are about the right age for that." Well, yes, indeed I have, and I can see that you are very wise and quite beautiful as well, Princess Calliope. But I am also looking for a queen who can bake gingerbread. Well, said Princess Calliope, now, as it happens, I am looking for a husband. And I need a husband who is kind as well as handsome. And I would really like him to be able to play the slide trombone. Can you play the slide trombone, King Pilaf? Well, no, said King Pilaf, but I can shoot an arrow as straight as the tail of a comet. I do not think that will do, said Princess Calliope. And I cannot bake gingerbread, and you cannot play the slide trombone. I do not think we are made for each other. I am so sorry. And when she smiled at him, King Pilaf wanted to be able to say that he could play the slide trombone, but it just wasn't the truth. And so he thanked Princess Calliope, and he and the Lord High Chamberlain traveled on. And so it went in every kingdom. Some of the princesses were wise, some of the princesses were beautiful, some were wise and beautiful, but none of them could bake gingerbread. So finally the king kissed the hand of the last princess, and he went back home to Mulligatawny. Well, when they got back home, the king brooded and he thought and he sulked a bit for a little while. And then he called the Lord High Chamberlain and he said, Chamberlain, it is clear that I am not going to find the perfect woman for me. So, go to the kingdom of, that first one we went to. The princess, was it Madelon? Yeah, the Madelon, the one that made the little almond cakey things. She was as wise as she was beautiful, and perhaps in time I can learn to love almond cakes. So go and offer to say that I would like to marry her. Well, when the Lord Chamberlain arrived in Princess Madelon's kingdom, he found that the kingdom was getting ready for a wedding. For Princess Madelon was going to marry the king of Rocky Knob Island. Well, all the Lord Chamberlain could do was offer his best wishes and turn around and go back home to Mulligatawny. King Pilaf said, well, that's all right. I didn't really like almond cakes anyway. How about let's go to, what was that second place? Shogun? That place. Yeah, that place with the Princess Jebel. Not as wise as she is beautiful, but perhaps in time I can learn to love Zweiback. And so the Lord Chamberlain went to the kingdom of Shogun and asked for the Princess Jebel's hand. But, much to his surprise, he found that the Princess Jebel was no longer there. For she had left a note on her crown for her father that said she was running off with a sourdough baker and she was going to bake miles and miles of Zweiback. Well, the Lord Chamberlain was very sad to return to the kingdom and tell King Pilaf that Princess Jebel was not available. And much to his surprise, the king jumped up from his crown and began to dance a little jig. He said, honestly, Chamberlain, the princess I would really like to marry is Princess Calliope. She is not as beautiful as she is wise, perhaps, but I really did kind of like her. So the Lord Chamberlain went to Princess Calliope and asked if she would be willing to marry King Pilaf. Well, Princess Calliope said she needed a little time to think about it. For King Pilaf was willing to not require her to be able to bake gingerbread, but she still wanted a man who could play the slide trombone. So she went to her room and she thought about it for a while. And eventually she came out and she said, Lord Chamberlain, I think I'm going to say yes. And so King Pilaf came to visit Princess Calliope, and she said, it seems to me, King Pilaf, that a husband who is kind as well as handsome is much more to be loved than one who can play on the slide trombone. Oh, and a wife who is wise as well as beautiful does not need to know how to make gingerbread, said King Pilaf. And he and Queen and Calliope agreed that they would put it into their wedding vows that neither one of them would ever again mention gingerbread or slide trombones. Well, they got married, and there was a grand celebration, and they lived very happily together for about a year, and they ruled the kingdom together very wisely and very kindly. But then, one day, everything just went wrong. The weather outside snowed one minute and rained the next. The king got up, and when he was getting dressed, he dropped his crown on his foot. His crown was rather heavy, and so it made his foot ache. The queen woke up, and she had a headache. The Lord Chamberlain was sick with a cold, and the cook slept late, so the breakfast wasn't ready. The court painter got up, and he was working on finishing up their Majesty's new portrait, and he tripped and put his head through the portrait. The king was angry and his foot hurt. The queen was cross and her head hurt, and they quarreled all day long. Have you ever noticed that that happens? When you don't feel good, you tend to fight with people. It's not a good way to do things. Well, in the middle of one of their arguments, the king looked at the queen and he said, "I just wish that you could bake gingerbread, then something would go right with this day." "And why, oh why," said the queen, "can't you play the slide trombone? If you could play the slide trombone, it might make my head feel a little better and settle my nerves." They glared at each other, and then they turned around and they walked off to opposite ends of the castle. The forbidden words had been spoken. Their wedding vows had been broken. And now they felt, well, first they felt angry, and they stayed in their opposite ends of the castle, feeling angry. And then they started to feel a little bit sorry for what they had said. The queen was sitting in her room. She heard the servant leave the tray of food outside the door and scurry away, just as they had ever since the argument, for none of the servants wanted to be near the king and the queen when they were very, very angry. The citizens of Mulligatawny outside had heard about the fight, and they were getting worried. Queen Calliope was sitting in her room, and she looked at herself in the mirror, and she said, "You know, you're really not that beautiful. King Pilaf married you because you were wise. Was it really wise to shout slide trombone at him? Not really." And so Queen Calliope got up, and she sent for the Lord High Chamberlain. At the other end of the castle, King Pilaf was shaving his chin. And he was thinking as he looked into the mirror, "You know, you really aren't that handsome. She married you because you were kind, not because you were handsome. Was it kind to shout gingerbread at her? Not really." And so he sent for the Lord High Chamberlain. Later that day, servants began scurrying away from one end of the castle, holding their noses for the most horrible smells of scorched pots were filling the air. And then they began running away from the other end of the castle as fast as they could go, holding their ears for the most terrible sounds, like an elephant with a cold trying to blow its nose were filling the air. And it was terrible. The servants ran from one end of the castle to the other, holding their noses or holding their ears for weeks. The citizens of Mulligatawny could smell the smells and they could hear the sounds, and they were starting to think maybe the world was coming to an end. But then, one day, the smells coming from one end of the castle got a little sweeter, and the sounds coming from the other end of the castle got a little sweeter. And before too long, the servants were hurrying towards one end of the castle with their noses in the air, smelling the wonderful, delicious smells. and they would be about their work in the other end of the castle, and they would just stop and listen to the beautiful music they were hearing. Finally, the Lord High Chamberlain announced that their majesties would come from their opposite ends of the castle, and they were going to meet right in the middle in the great hall. Everybody that could be there was there. Everybody wanted to see what was going on. With a blast of trumpets and a great fanfare, the door at one end of the great hall opened, and in came the king, with an apron tied around his waist, a baker's hat on his head, and flour on his nose. He was carrying a pan of the most delicious smelling, most perfect gingerbread that had ever been baked in that kingdom or in any other. Then, without any sound at all, the doors at the other end of the great hall swung open, and in stepped the queen. She was carrying a slide trombone. She stopped, and she lifted it up to her lips, and she started to play. And the music that she played was so beautiful that even the nightingales stopped singing to listen. And from that day on, the very first smell that the citizens of Mulligatawny smelt in the morning was King Pilaf's gingerbread. And the very first sound that they heard was Queen Calliope's slide trombone. And it became the custom of the citizens to wake up at sunrise, to sniff, and to listen. And that was how they knew that all was well in the kingdom. And until the end of their days, the people of Mulligatawny were never disappointed. And that is the story of the queen who couldn't bake gingerbread from Germany. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll come back and join us again on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Central Time. We will have another story for you here from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.